Dr. Duckworth. It's great to have you on. Now, you are the very famous author of the book Grit, which taught all of the people in the public about grit and how to get it. You were also a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. So it's great to have you on.
Thank you, Taylor. I'm really excited for our conversation.
Yes, it's awesome. Now, could you just explain to our listeners and the general public who may be listening why you decided to study grit and what's the story behind that?
When I was much younger than I am today, maybe around your age, I started to, ask myself, like, how smart am I, compared to my brother, my sister, compared to my cousins who live in Boston, who my parents keep telling me are like smarter than any of us. What about in my homeroom? And I came to the conclusion that I was definitely not the smartest person in my homeroom, in my family. And I wondered, what am I going to be able to accomplish in my life? Like, what are the limits? And I came to study this quality called grit, passion and perseverance for long-term goals, because it's not the same as your innate ability, and yet it is really predictive of accomplishing important things. So I study the psychology of effort and all those things that when I was around your age, I decided, like, well, that's maybe where I'm going to play.
That's really ironic because you actually got the Genius Award, or what its nickname is.
Yeah, and you know what? For somebody who is much younger than I am, I just want to praise you for using the word irony correctly. So yes, that was a good example of irony, because this award, which has this nickname of being the Genius Grant, ended up going to somebody whose dad kept telling her over and over again, you're no genius.
It is very ironic, but obviously, not all the what everyone thinks of you about your IQ actually is what other people think of you. I find that very interesting. Now that
Have you taken the SAT yet?
I've taken versions, like the younger version of it. I'm
Yeah, like
not.
the
Yeah, I
SAT.
don't exactly know what exactly I got, but yeah.
Well, so at dinner last night, so my younger daughter is 17, and we were talking about how, like, she had done her SAT, and then my dad was, or her dad, my husband was remembering how he had done, and I was remembering my scores. And she looked at us and she was like, I think it's kind of pathetic that you guys still remember your SAT scores. Like, like your life is more than half over. This is ridiculous. And I had to agree with her. So it's not that I don't believe that these tests have some function, but I kind of like resent the obsession that all of us seem to have with what's your score, and it takes on this like towering importance, like it becomes we think our destiny. But of course my husband and I are old enough to know that it is not.
Yeah, that's very funny that a lot of the general public obsesses over these IQ scores and ACT scores and all the test scores. When, as your book states, a lot of it, one of the main qualities is grit really helps with your life and its achievement. So actually, that leads right into our next question: how does IQ relate to grit itself?
Well, measures of IQ are not positively correlated with grit. In other words, usually a zero correlation, like they're totally independent. If I know your SAT, ACT, or IQ score, I just have no idea whether you're high grit, low grit, or somewhere in between. And in some of my data, I find that they're inversely correlated, meaning that the higher your score on these cognitive tests, sometimes the lower your grit score, although of course there are exceptions. But I think the take home for all of us is that however we do on these tests, it tends to be pretty independent from our tendency to pursue long-term goals with passion and perseverance.
Yeah, I definitely find that very fascinating.
That's
I hope
great.
so. I really like that you guys are, digging into psychology, because I feel like one of the superpowers that you might develop in life is like an understanding of human nature. Because, whether you grow up to be a CEO um, or or anything really, like understanding human motivation and why people do what they do, not just grit, but other aspects of character too, can be really helpful.
Yeah, that I definitely find that very fascinating. So, as I was reading your book, you talked a lot about different people who developed grit, and the cultures that they developed grit in. So one of the ones you said was the swimmers who get up at 5 a.m. and they swim in the freezing cold. I don't know. Well, I never swam before, really, like they do, but in the pool water super early in the morning. And obviously, that's to everyone who's not a swimmer and doesn't do that. That seems insane. So, what does culture relate to grit? Like, how does that? What's the correlation there?
When you think of something like, grit, you think of the person who is gritty. And then if you have a mental picture, there's like a blank screen and then there's a person, right? Maybe in silhouette. But actually, if you change that mental image to be a person who's gritty with all different people around them, right? Like I think we're mostly at our best when we're in teams, right? So if you think about how you accomplished this podcast, it wasn't just you. There were other people who were involved. And then, of course, you have this audience that's growing. And I think that we are our best as people when we're with each other. And these swimmers who get up at 5 in the morning and get into the pool, if you ask the question, like hypothetically, could they do that day in, day out, 365 days a year if they were the only ones getting into the pool, like setting the alarm? No, they're not. And when they get to the pool, their teammates are there and they're also like, oh my gosh, I can't believe so I think my research, in fact, is going to go more and more towards, thinking about how people change in groups, not not so much, how they change all by themselves.
Yeah, that I find that very fascinating. That it's positive peer pressure. We've talked about that on our podcast. Negative peer pressure. We've had advice to teenagers that's basically don't give in to negative peer pressure. But that's a double-edged sword. So there's also positive peer pressure, and I think a lot of people forget about that.
Yeah, well, it's good to have somebody like you remind everyone because it's so true, right? Like if you just think peer pressure, what do you think? It's like, don't do drugs, don't smoke, right? Like don't do anything, don't go on social media, right? But peer pressure is just a feature of human experience. It, as you know, probably by now, but I'll say to those who are listening, biologically, when you go through adolescence, that is the transition from childhood to adulthood, and all mammals like dogs and cats, they all have an adolescent period, right? And that transition has lots of things going on. But one of the things that goes on is that you become more sensitive to peer opinion. Like, you don't want to be unpopular, you don't want to be excluded. And that's partly because, we have evolved that way from generations of our history. So the bottom line is that it can be used for good, it can be used for bad. And I think the practical recommendation is that if I were you and I were thinking about, November and December and how you're going to handle the next months and years ahead, I would think, who are my peers going to be? Because you will start to be a lot like your friends. And so you might want to be a little choosy when it comes to who you are spending time with.
For sure. That's been that I believe two people have recommended that advice. Like you are who your friends are was what one of our local interviews said. I find that very fascinating. So speaking of advice, we've had several like 18, maybe 20 or more guests that we've interviewed that we haven't always posted their interviews yet. And a lot of them, Dr. Alter, author of Irresistible, and almost all of our guests always recommend try lots of things to develop a passion. And that's very fascinatingly is one of the things that you have in your book. One of the ways you develop grit is by, trying lots of things. So what do you have to say about that advice that we keep? Do you agree with it, or what are your thoughts on it?
I do, and I think that if you ask anybody who has, whatever, I can't even name all the jobs, and the jobs that people have are not the jobs that you learn about when you're in high school. Like you only learn about like doctor, lawyer, CEO, but there are just millions of jobs. I mean, some people grow up to be midwives, like some people, grow up to be like this particular thing that I can't even tell you because I don't even know what that job title is. So how do people find their way into these niches? Well, it's a lot of sampling, and that's the term scientists sometimes use for this process by which you try stuff, and then either you like it and you want to go and do it more, or you like spit it out and you're like, bleh, don't want to do that. Hate sitting in a like windowless room all day. When I was in college, I thought I wanted to, maybe be a like biochemist, like a professor at a medical school who would like cure brain cancer or something like Alzheimer's. I was actually working in a lab that says Alzheimer's. And part of me wanted to do that. Like, I like science, I want to help people. But I really literally found that the smell and the experience of being in this like windowless room for like 12 hours a day waiting around for my gels to get to the point where I could like take them, I was like, I do not want to do this anymore. And that was good. Like, so I think my advice to you is just like these other people have been saying, but when you do something like an internship, or you shadow somebody for a day, or you have a quick conversation and you're like, wow, I don't want to do that, you should be happy, because a lot of life is learning by process of elimination.
That's great. So, this is something that kind of correlates with your book, but would you agree with the statement, you should never quit?
Maddie, I do not agree with the statement you should never quit. I quit piano when I was even younger than you are right now. I was like, the world does not need another mediocre piano player from New Jersey, right? Which is what I was. And I quit French. Now I actually really like French, but like I at one point when I was 23, and I was like, okay, the only way I can keep speaking French decently and get better is if I speak it a lot. And either I could do that, or I could, do more public service and tutoring and so forth. So I in a way quit French. And that's an even more useful example, because it's not like I stopped liking French. But I think you guys are going to quit. I mean, you're going to quit so many things, because I think the thing that you will always lack, no matter however rich you get, is time. You only get 168 hours a week, whether you're as rich as Jeff Bezos or as poor as a pauper. So the reason why I think quitting is important is because you can't do everything. You might be able to do anything, but you definitely can't do everything. So quitting is useful. Don't quit on a bad day. That's my major thing. Like, it's not that you should never quit, but I don't think you should quit on one of those days where you're just, you're so full of self-doubt that you can't see clearly. If you are quitting on a good day, you're like, I won the game, and I still don't like this, and you still want to quit, then probably quitting is the right thing. And when I quit piano, I quit on a good day.
That's awesome. So, these are the two questions that we ask all of our guests. The first one is, what books have had an impact on you and why?
I would say that the books that have had an impact on me are all memoirs. They're all people telling their own stories. So I guess they're autobiographies. And I think that we learn so much by, kind of following along in somebody's life. And one I especially recommend to you that I'm literally looking at right now is a biography of E.B. White, who wrote Charlotte's Web. And if you read that, you'll understand why he wrote Charlotte's Web, and what Charlotte's Web really means. And anyway, memoirs are great, and biographies are great too.
That's really fascinating and definitely very unique, but those sound fascinating. We'll have to definitely check those out. And so the last question we have is, what advice do you have for teenagers?
My advice for you is maybe to avoid one of the mistakes that I made, right? So when I went to college, I was just like you guys, super hardworking, really ambitious, but I did make a mistake, and I only realized it at my 25th reunion. So the mistake was that with all that hard work and all that goal orientation that got me pretty far in life, I think I did not spend as much time as I needed to with friends. So when I got to my 25th reunion, and I'm looking around, and like everyone else is like just so happy to see their roommates who they stayed in touch with, and they're like hugging, and I was like, wow, I don't have as many people to hug at my 25th reunion. I wish I could go back in time and spend a little less time on my projects and my activities, and just a little bit more, having late night conversations with friends, and wasting time together, and all the things that really make people bonded to each other for life.
That's awesome. I'm the exact same way. My mom has told me frequently, Maddie, I get that you have a goal and I get that you want to finish it, but like she'll force me to go out and go on walks with people or go hang out with friends. And in the end, I'm very happy I did. So that's great advice.
Moms are often right.
Very much. Very much.
Yes, well, thank you so much, Dr. Duckworth, for sharing your advice and coming on our podcast to explain about grit. It was awesome having you on.
Thank you, Maddie. Thank you, Taylor. I love this conversation. I wish both of you the best of luck as well.